Hello everybody, this is Mr. Wes Moore, your instructor for macroeconomics. I hope that you're having a great day. I'm looking forward to this session, session 5 of our course on macroeconomics. In this session we'll be talking about counting and tracking GDP. So let's take a look and see what we want to discuss in this session. There'll be 4 things that we'll talk about here. There first will be 2 ways to count GDP. Remember, GDP is gross domestic product. So we want to talk about how we count it, how we account for it each year. And those 2 ways will be the expenditure or spending approach and the income approach. And then finally we'll wrap up by talking about price indexes or price indices, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And that's all about tracking inflation when we're talking about GDP. So let's get started then with 2 ways to count GDP. As you probably remember, GDP stands for gross domestic product. It is the total of all the goods and services produced in the country in a year or a period. Sometimes we talk about GDP quarterly. We also talk about it per year. And the United States has a pretty complex system for counting all that we produce in this nation in a year, and it's called the National Income Accounting System. It's a complex system of data used to determine the GDP in the United States, and it's actually something that has led the world in learning how to track what a nation produces in a year. And there are 2 approaches, as we've already indicated in the introduction and the overview of the session. There is the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach is really about spending. That is a way of counting all of what was produced in the nation by counting what individual segments of the nation spend, what they spend on final goods, on products. So that's the expenditure approach. And then we have the income approach. The income approach. That is sort of the flip side. Instead of looking at what we have produced or what we've bought for ourselves, we're looking at the other side, which is income. What did the producers receive in terms of income? And those should balance out. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's take a look at these 2 ways of counting GDP. As I've said, the result is the same either way because income equals spending. If we spend it, from when you're talking about accounting, if you spend it, then it has to come from income. So it balances out either way you do this. Both should be the same. In fact, they can be a check on one another. So what about this expenditure or spending approach? In this approach, those folks in the government who are accounting look at all the spending in the nation, and they group it by major categories. And those categories are consumption, number 1. They look at what was consumed, and consumption is considered really household spending. What individuals and families spend on final goods and services, whether it's food or homes or appliances or whatever. Household spending is consumption. And then they add to that what's called investment spending. Investment spending has to do with businesses, and it's what they spend building new facilities, buying new machines, constructing things. Investment spending. That's for businesses. And then the third of the 4 spending categories that the government looks at when it calculates GDP is the spending by the government itself. And the government purchases goods and services for itself, and that is counted as spending. That is buying final goods and services, so it falls under the GDP calculation. Government spending does not include transfer payments. Now, transfer payments are when the government taxes some portion of the population, and then they take the money that they've taxed and they give it to someone else. It's not something they earn. So when the government takes money out of taxpayers' pockets and pays unemployment benefits, which we'll talk about in the next session, that's a transfer payment. When the government takes money from the more wealthy folks and gives it to the poor, that's a transfer payment. But that does not count as GDP because it's not really producing anything, it's not earning anything, it's just transferring money from one pot, if you will, to another. And then finally, there's net exports. Exports are the products that we make here in the United States and we ship overseas to other people. That's an export. It goes out. But there are also imports that come in. We are buying things from other nations, cars, video game consoles, you name it, and they're coming into the nation. So net exports is how much is left over of exports after you count the imports. So if your exports were $10 billion and your imports were $9 billion, then your net exports would be $1 billion. But the United States is such a large consumer, we do export a tremendous amount, but we're usually a net importer. In other words, we import more than we export. So that usually takes away from GDP because we're buying from other people more than we're selling to other nations. So that's the expenditure approach, just talking about what is spent in these various categories of the economy. Now the income approach is just really the flip side of that. It's trying to calculate gross domestic product from what the suppliers or the producers are receiving as payments for the products that they make. So it's the other side of the coin. And the income approach formally is counting the final value of everything produced and sold in the nation instead of everything that was bought. The expenditure approach is what's bought. The income approach is counting the final value of what we produce in the nation. So it includes the wages, the rent, the interest, and the profit that is associated with making something. So if I build a picnic table and I'm paying my workers, then that's counted. If I'm paying for my building, that's counted. If I'm paying interest on a loan, that's counted. And the profit that I make, all of that is counted. And the important thing here is that the big concern is called double counting. Double counting. So if I make something and I count my labor once and then somebody else takes the value of what I sold them, say I sold them a table for $100, and they count that $100 in their price of say $150, then that's sort of double counting because I've already counted that $100. So the term that's used for the calculation here is called value added. So let's say that I'm making those picnic tables, and I make a picnic table for $100 and I sell it to you. And in my $100, as I've said, I've already counted all my payments to my employees, my rent, my interest, and my profit is in that $100. I sell that to you, and then you take that table and you stain it, and you add some decorative moldings, and you put some wheels on it and a handle so you can move it more easily, and then you sell it for $150. Well, you can't count the $100 that I've already sold it for because that's already been counted. So the way that they count it is they just count the value added, that $50 of additional value. And if you count the value added all the way down until the product is actually sold, then you end up with the total income for that product. So now let's talk about understanding price indexes. You remember from a previous session that we talked about the need to take out inflation from gross domestic product when we're doing the calculation year over year, because if we don't, we can get a skewed number of what the economy grew in that year's period. So if we had we made the same level of stuff, but prices went up 3% in the year that we're the next year, then it's going to look like we had a 3% economy growth, but we actually didn't. So we have to take out that inflation. Well, when we take out that inflation, you remember that's called real GDP, the real GDP. I don't think I mentioned this to you in the previous session, but when you're talking about GDP that doesn't have inflation taken out, that is called nominal GDP, nominal. That's just the calculation without any inflation taken out of it. But here's the goal. If we want to be able to compare years quickly to see how much inflation has changed over a period of years, not just say 1 year from 2019 to 2020, for example, but we want to go and we want to say, for example, how much did inflation change from 2012 to 2016? Well, instead of having to sit down and add up inflation numbers, there are things that have been created called price indexes, a price index. And what a price index does is it takes the year, every year, and it translates it into an index that allows you to compare years very easily. Let me show you how this works. First of all, you come up with a base year. You pick a year, let's say 2010, and indexes use different years. But you pick a year and you make that year equal to 100. That's called the base year or the baseline. And then what you do is you just add the years around that. And you calculate off of that 100 based on the amount of inflation that existed in that year. So for example here, in 2010, that's our base year, that's 100. The index is 100. But in 2011, that's 102. And 2012, it's 105. What that means from 100 to 102 is that the inflation rate between 2010 and 11 was 2%. But if you wanted to go down and jump to, say, 2013 and 14, and these aren't real numbers, I just made these up. These aren't actual measurements. But what you find there is you've got just 1%. Well, that's easy. That's easy enough, right? But what if you wanted to look at the difference between 2014 and 2010 very quickly? Well, because 2014 is 108 and 2010 is 100, and we've got these all relative to one another, then we know that inflation went up 8% between 2010 and 2014. You see how that works? So price indexes, and there are a number of different kinds of price indexes, but they are very helpful to being able to figure out what the inflation was between different years. One of the ones that you'll hear talked about the most is called the Consumer Price Index. And the Consumer Price Index is basically, they take this group of goods, they call it a basket of products or a basket of goods. It's a different list of products. And they're comparing the cost of those year over year over year over year, and then they're indexing them so you can tell. And this helps to see what consumers, me and you, when we buy stuff for ourselves or our families, what is our price change looking like. So the Consumer Price Index is a very common price index, and one that you'll hear referenced in the media and in your economics textbooks. So that's it. That is the content for Session 5, Counting and Tracking GDP. I hope that you picked up a few things for it, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Have a great day.